Hi everyone. I've enabled microphones for everyone, and I've also enabled cameras for everyone, so you're more than welcome to come on screen. And as we go through, if you want to ask questions or participate in discussion, please feel free to do so. So welcome to webinar with Michael Van Horenbeeck and myself. We are planning to just talk about kind of unlocking big bang migrations in merger and acquisition type scenarios. I'll let Michael introduce himself first, since he's on the left of the screen, and I'll follow.
First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. So for those who don't know me, but I do see some familiar names. I'm Michael. I run a bunch of consultants at the collective, specialized in all things Microsoft. And one part of it is migrations as well. We've been doing them for a long time. I've actually been doing them for about 20 years, which is one of the reasons why I'm joining Twan today to share a little bit of our experiences, but also on some tips and tricks on stuff that we learned along the way.
Great, thank you, Michael. And my name's Twan van Beers. I own Nero Blanco along with Comrade Neil, and we've been doing migrations in that company for about 12 years. I myself, like Michael, have been doing migrations back since the year 2000 or so, somewhere around there. Obviously, tenant to tenant, Microsoft migrations, not quite that old, probably about 10, 11 years ago now. Been on the stack, the Microsoft stack, for a long time as well. It's kind of started in Windows 3 days and NT 351 back in mid-90s, early 90s, yeah. And the other company that I own and work in as a product manager is PowerSyncPro, or declaration software, where we have written software to kind of help with some of these migrations. So that's me for my sins. In terms of just a high-level agenda, we've got some talking points to kind of get the juices flowing, but we really wanted to make this just a discussion, so anyone can ask questions, contribute, try and keep this relatively fluid, flexible. So one thing that I want to start on is kind of some key challenges that we find with tenant-to-tenant type migrations. And often it hinges around people not actually being able to define the scope clearly, or they can define the scope, but they decide, the client says, oh, well, I don't want to migrate everyone. Let's just do this business unit now and then another business unit later. And sometimes that's even when you need to move domains between tenants. So you kind of have to explain some of the limitations around tenant-to-tenant migrations.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, so it's an interesting point that you make there. To be fair, right? Because scoping, I probably that anyone who's been a consultant has touched scopes and wants to defend their scope, but all things considered, looking at it from a customer perspective, it is a moving train. It is a moving target, right? Which makes getting the scope right and even getting how many users do we need to move, whether it's from a licensing perspective or just understanding what needs to be done, just makes it really hard because there's no, unless you're migrating very small environments, it's always, in flux, right? Could be more than what you initially bargained for. It could be a little less, but it's really hard though.
Yeah, we find that even more so with a divestiture scenario where actually the people that are being divested, you sometimes know the actual people involved, although even there, sometimes that's not always clear. But then when you get down to shared resources, it's like, well, okay, well, if I migrate this group of people, what am I going to break? Like, what are they owners? What are they owners of? What are they touching? What are they using? And then if I migrate those resources, okay, well, who's now left behind who doesn't have access to these resources? Or it's a bifurcated solution where you've got two teams or two shared mailboxes or whatever the shared resources on both sides.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like a spider web, right? When I go and talk to customers and explain how to build a scope, how to make sure that you include everything that you actually need. I also tell them, hey, chances are that you're going to start with one thing, and then you'll find out that it's connected to two other things. And then in turn, these two other things are connected to two more things. And before you know it, you touch everything in the environment. And, once
Yes.
you get a feel for that, once you know, hey, everything is somehow interconnected, whether it's through delegates or permissions or, different groups accessing the same resources. At some point, you're going to have to make the call and just call this is where it's going to break, or, this is where I draw the line. Or even technically, some things can be moved, and then you just have to accept the fact that, things are what they are, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And like you say, though, even when people are actually doing a whole merger, so the entire company's merging together, they sometimes the client says, well, I only want to migrate active content. Like, okay, that's great, but how do you define active content? Like, just because content hasn't been updated doesn't necessarily mean it's not in use. So all those questions. And Andrew, I see you've got a question there as well. You got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Twan. You mentioned domains earlier in the scope. That's always been one of the real issues I've had, because it's move the domain first, move it last, or even when it comes to sharing the domain, because you can use, I know, third-party tools products like Mimecast, and do the SMTP rewrite. But how do you deal with that in scoping usually?
So you're stealing the thunder of what we were going to talk about later. But, since we kind of have the elephant in the room, do not do any coexistence. That's the story for this webinar today, right? Kind of avoid it at all costs. That's what I look at, right? At some point, you've got an environment of a certain size that you just can't theoretically move at once. And then you'll just have to deal with the oddfall of having to deal with coexistence in some shape, way, or form. And then, that's when things get ugly. I think email domains is just one thing, and it's one very small, easy thing that we've been dealing with for 25 years. I see some folks in the call that have been doing Exchange migrations for nearly that time frame, and it's well understood. We know, hey, you want to share a domain name, you can in the cloud, put something in between, do address rewriting, and life is great. But how about everything else, where there is no real, routing, rewriting stuff, where you just have to, put people through a certain amount of pain. And that's what you really have to avoid and kind of understand, and where that scoping comes into play. But there's other factors in that as well.
Yeah, and thinking about domains, we do have that problem as well, Andrew, where some of the larger ones we've moved between 80 and 90 domains in a weekend for 10 to 20,000 users. It's a pretty harrowing weekend for the people migrating, right? Getting that domain off getting all those domains off the tenant is kind of the key part. Once you get past that, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief, and you can move forward knowing you've got a predictable timeline now. And there aren't really any easy answers. Like Michael said, you've got third-party products. You can actually ask Microsoft to force an accepted domain into your second tenant with the same domain name as the one in the other tenant. But you get yourself into a situation where your tenant is now strange. So you run into problems that just aren't tested by third parties or by Microsoft anymore. So you put yourself into that odd situation where your tenant is just different from everyone else.
Yeah. So around the domain name sharing, right? It's not possible, right? You can do some back tricks where you can quote unquote force a domain name into a tenant, but it doesn't help with the routing because it's still broken. You get into that exception scenario. So, provided that you don't have to do any coexistence. So let's just start with that, because I think that's kind of the point that we're trying to make today, is like, if you can avoid it at all cost, especially for email domains, it basically means that move everyone first and then move off the domains. And when I say move off the domains, is get them detached from the source tenant and get them attached to the target tenant. Now, there is the in-between period where you've already moved off data from the source to the target, and new email is still coming in into the source. So how'd you deal with that? And you could go the elaborate way of forwarding everything from source to target, which is how we typically would have done it in the early days, and how on-premises Exchange Server would move between two Exchange orgs and stuff. In the cloud, I just found that it's easier to use a store and forward service where you're just, ahead of the migration, you point MX records to a service that will just queue the messages for you for X amount of hours. You said Mimecast, but there's others out there as well. You just halt delivery, and then as soon as everything has moved over to the target environment, you just release them from that queue and have them just target the new tenant at once, which kind of helps with the email delivery. Sure, there's going to be a delay. So for business critical services, that doesn't really solve that problem. But then again, we can't solve everything at the same time. But that works really well and is very, incomplex. It's super easy to work with, right? You just change the MX record at one point, deliver, change the MX record again, and off you go. And I find that works really well. And also from a costing perspective, that's very sustainable. Like there's no yearly cost. Typically, we use a migration service that charges X amount of dollars per domain for a migration, which also helps because migrations, generally speaking, are quite expensive.
Yeah, we often use whatever the message hygiene is that the incumbent uses. You mentioned Mimecast, Proofpoint, others have kind of a similar approach where you can just pause mail for a period while you're messing around with the back end, untangling everything.
Yep.
And we've talked about mail, but the other one now that's becoming problematic, of course, is Teams. We can create guests. We can do things like pre-stage mailboxes, but as soon as you create an object, a user, it's going to appear in Teams, and people get confused very quickly as to who they need to chat to. Like, okay, then they know they want to chat to Michael, but now there is a guest account appearing. There's potentially an external account from before, and now there's an internal mailbox as well. All three of them are Michael, and Michael on the other end may not be listening to all three of those connection options. So again, with the coexistence, we often struggle with that, where the people that are actually already on the tenant we're going to don't really know how best to communicate. And you get, well, I did send you this on Teams, and the other person, well, I never saw it. Where did you send it to? And eventually they find out it's gone to an account that the second person doesn't actually monitor.
Yeah, and even if you work with the workarounds where you add an out of office or you change the display name, stuff like that, that doesn't really help because typically the one who sends a message doesn't even consider it, right? Because they just go to a chat that they already had with you, and then just continue in that chat window. So typically they don't even notice that you've moved. It's different when it's someone who has never talked to you before is actually looking you up and then sees a display name or sees in brackets has moved or something of the sorts. But that again is a testimony to why you want to avoid that coexistence. But I mean, there are scenarios in which coexistence, I'm not going to say makes sense, but is certainly somewhat easier, and that's when you can just have two distinct tenants live next to one another. So when we're talking about a merger of two organizations, but each having their own identity and maintaining their own identity after the migration, you don't run into the how do I deal with domain names or stuff like that. It's once you start merging into, or if you want to maintain, the domain names or the branding itself across two tenants when it starts becoming a problem. So let's say company A and company B each have their tenant. Company B merges with company A, gets the company A branding. Life's great because as you move them along, they go from B to A, and you just tell everyone, look up A and you forget about B. Life's great. Ultimately, from an email perspective, you can do aliases afterwards or forward messages. That's fine. But it's easy, right? Because, hey, Michael has moved over and he's now company A instead of company B. But what if company A acquires company B, or you merge a tenant, but you keep your own identity? Now, your identity and by extension, your branding, company B lives in both one tenant and the other tenant. And that just gets you in all sorts of troubles, not just from an email perspective or Teams perspective, but all sorts of other stuff. We're not even talking about how do you deal with guest users. Oh, apps.
Yeah,
right?
yes, there's all kinds of things in there. Like you said, external guests. You being a guest into a third-party tenant, or a third party being a guest in your tenant that you're now migrating out of. So the tools don't really help with that situation. Like there's bits and pieces, isn't there? But ultimately, you end up having to re-invite the user after you migrate it, or contact the third-party tenant to say, "Hey, I've now migrated. Can you re-invite me?" Which is easy, like you said. Again, if company A has become company B, so they've actually their branding has changed, it's kind of a little bit easier. But if you keep the same branding, the third-party tenant already has a Michael at company A in that in their environment, so they can't just add Michael at company A because he's already there. So they have to know to go to their admin, delete him, wait, add them back in, wait again. It's definitely not simple. Any of the tenant migrations anymore.
Yeah, and that's because of all the different identity types, right? We've got the regular users, the guest users, and all the versions in between. And to be fair, I think Microsoft has a quote unquote responsibility of making some of the end user experiences better over time. But I mean, I fully understand why the redemption flow is what it is, and you get invited as a guest, and you accept an invite, and then you get an identity, and that identity can be used to access resources. Yay, that's fine. But I think there should be an equivalent for, hey, I know that you're a guest of Michael's tenant, but Michael's now getting married to company A, and I just want to move you over, and it should be seamless for the invitee at all point. Like I should be able to move you over, should be able to add you to all the resources. And for you, when you go to an older resource, it should theoretically be fully transparent. We're a long way from that. And quite frankly, we can't solve all those problems because part of it is, work that Microsoft theoretically needs to do. But to be fair, I don't think that any of these scenarios are considered when developing any of the solutions they have. I think, migrations, and especially tenant to tenant migrations, are a distant thought for some people, as in, okay, yeah, we might get to it at some point in the future if the whole Gen AI stuff is past us.
Yeah, absolutely. The other area that we find that is typically forgotten about is the workstations. It's all well and good migrating someone, but they could be hybrid joined to their old tenant, or Entra joined to their old tenant, or even if they're just registered, how do you get the user to update themselves to go to the new tenant? It isn't really as easy as signing out and signing back in if you've got things like OneDrive and other things in place as well. So that was one of the reasons why we developed PowerSyncPro, the migration agent tool, so that you have an agent sitting on the machine, you tell it at a certain time, okay, I want that machine to migrate now, or you can give the user a self-migrate option if you wanted to, just to take that pain away. Like we did a big migration for J. Walter Thompson back in 2016, 15, somewhere around there. 15,000 users, 83 domains, all moved over on a single weekend. Kind of underestimated on the Monday. It was supported by IBM, so they had plenty of support people, but we underestimated just how few people actually read user communication. And when they do get to user communication, it's often at a level that doesn't quite match up with their skill level, or the screens have ever so slightly changed in between times. So now the button that you said was going to be there isn't exactly the same as it was when you wrote the communication. So again, that was part of the drivers. Like, okay, if we have an agent that does all that for you, at least it migrates the device to the new tenant, either Entra joined or hybrid joined. It resets all of the Microsoft applications back to more of an out-of-the-box state. The user types in their credentials, or if they get a PRT, it's SSOs through and they're up and away. And we found in Nero Blanco, because obviously I wrote it first for Nero Blanco, it was a game changer. We've done migrations since 12,000 at AWS, all going at the same time. We did S&P Global as well. They're slightly bigger, so they went in 4 consecutive fortnights. That was part of the reason what you mentioned, that some organizations just are too big and too risk averse to do everyone at the same time, and for good reason. But yeah, we just couldn't do migrations at that scale now without a tool in place.
Yeah, and I think you make an excellent point, right? That the impact on. So let me attack this differently. The user experience or the lack thereof, or the ability to support users on a Monday morning, are the key drivers to determine whether or not you can do a big bang migration or not. All the other challenges that we talked about earlier are all in some shape, way, or form mitigated by tooling, right? As I said, you can move over 20,000 mailboxes if you store them forward, or if you forward messages while you wait for the domains to switch from one tenant to another, right? And even though you have a 24-hour SLA of deconnecting a domain and reconnecting it, I mean, it all fits properly within a weekend. But just like on-premises Active Directory migrations, where computer objects needed to move, and at that once you move a computer object, you move the user profile, which may or may not get a new username in the new forest. We kind of amplify that challenge when a device is connected to a tenant, whether it's hybrid joined, Entra ID joined, and you somehow have to deal with that. Now, to the point where users themselves, they shouldn't really care. To be fair, I think from an IT perspective, we always complain about the fact that end users don't read their messages, or they don't understand what we're reading, what we're writing, right? What we're telling them. But at the end of the day, it's like, someone coming in and explaining all the electricity, wiring and stuff in the house. I do have some notions, but I'm not an expert, nor should I be, right? I'm just like, make sure that when I flip the switch, it works. And so from that perspective, having that ability, to me, is the key factor to unlocking the big bang migrations. Because once you have that, once the Monday morning rush hour, 8 o'clock calls on the help desk are yay high, like not this high, but very low, that's when you can actually scale to thousands of devices and users over a weekend easily, and thus make your life a lot easier. So I think that's heavily underrated.
Yeah, totally agree, and especially with businesses now going more to Entra join. Of course, you end up having to migrate the devices like in the old AD days, isn't it? You end up having to do something about it. And we also find that more and more tenants are now getting more secure, so they often require hybrid or Entra joined, and sometimes even compliant devices. So again, trying to get a user to do that manually, it's just starting to become a bit of a non-starter nowadays. I don't know how people on the call, how you deal with that sort of stuff today, whether you just live with the device in the old state for a period of time and you relax the security posture on the target to compensate for that, or you require users to do something, or you have developed scripting to do something.
The last one I did was scripts. So just used Intune to kind of collect the hardware hash of all the devices in the source tenant, and then schedule scripts to run that runs a wipe of that device, but then puts the hash in the new tenant, and then just autopilot. Yeah, it's a blank machine. But sometimes when you're starting in a new environment, you want it to be clean. So it kind of worked. That was only for sub 1,000 users. It's about 900 odd. But it worked.
Yeah, we do see that as well. Sorry, Michael. We do see that as well, where some companies on the target, they don't really trust the computer that came from the source in the first place. So then a wipe would make sense as well. Sometimes hard to...
a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but...
Yes, I was going to say, sometimes hard to get that user experience right. So A, autopilot need to work, and B, work in a kind of a timely fashion. And definitely COVID's made things harder as well, right? Like more and more people are not actually working in the office, or in a way refusing to come into the office for these sort of things. They just want to be at home. So doing all these things remotely becomes harder. Like, how do you support a user when autopilot didn't work? Like, you'll have to ship them a new device potentially.
Yeah, and I think um, there's a difference between divestitures and mergers, or where you're moving in together. There's some level of trust at some point where, especially in the larger migrations, you see hey, we're going to relax the settings for a short period of time, just to allow that big bang migration and to avoid having everyone not re-enroll, but restage their devices, because that is very disruptive. Like, if you do that on a Monday morning, unless you come from a very clean environment where, restaging your device is, like being every Monday morning, um, there is a huge user impact. And despite the fact that, I have an opinion about users, generally speaking, I try to be on their team when planning a migration, right? Because I
Yes.
just put myself in the seat on the Monday morning, and I want to make that migration as seamless and as smooth as possible. Because at the end of the day, right, what's the metric for a successful migration? And it's not going to be, hey, I moved all the data over and I didn't lose a single file, or it was super reliable or super fast. The success of a migration is measured by the number of calls on a Monday morning and the whining afterwards, right? If everyone's like, hey, this was smooth, we didn't notice a lot, and there's maybe some calls here and there, you're gonna get the clapping and be like, yeah, this was good. But if the Monday morning is a disaster, then you can say, hey, this was a fast migration, I moved everything over. Still going to be a shitty migration. So you kind of have to put that into perspective as well, and try and avoid to get that that user impact. And even though I'm really into things from a security perspective, I'm willing to accept that 3 day window where I'm going to be, hey, non-compliant devices only for these users, only from there. Yes, I'm going to collect the hashes. Yes, I'm going to make sure they're capable of being reset. And then over time, I'm going to slowly start doing that. But in the meantime, I'm going to try and get them, in tune enrolled, get their old policies imported, or, get them up to on par with new policies, rather than restaging, because that's a drastic measure, though.
Yeah, definitely at scale. Like, I don't know if Microsoft has official guidelines as to how many machines you can autopilot at the same time. We've never been brave enough to do it with, when we do 10,000 on a weekend. So will autopilot actually handle doing that many machines all at the same time? Like, I don't really know what the answer is there.
In theory, it should. Like, the way Intune scales up in the back, it does, but there is a delay, right? I mean, if you're going to fire 10,000 autopilots at once, there's no way this is going to be performing. And also, I wouldn't even bet on the fact that it's all going to run in a weekend, even if they scale up the infrastructure plus the outfall. Like, if you do 10,000 devices at once, there are going to be devices that are going to be quote unquote bricked, where you're going to have to intervene one way or another. If they're all in the same location, okay, good. It's easy. If they're remote, it becomes, tenfold more difficult in order to reach those people, or to give them the support they need. And I'm not talking about, them having to drive into the office to get support. It's the remote locations, because typically, let's not forget that to how the world has changed, people are very remote, even in your own organization, Twan, like the people all over Europe. Like, if you'd have to do this, then, what if a device over in Spain is having issues and you've got no one else to support them in Spain? It just makes things interesting, to say the least, I would say.
Yeah, definitely.
So, but I mean, going back, right, to making a point, I think data fidelity is one thing. Like, there are workloads that we've come to understand really well, easily. And I think that the major workloads, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and parts of Teams, um, it's no longer a big challenge to move them. Sure, there are the exceptions of, tool X doesn't do that, tool Y doesn't do that. So picking the right tool for the migration is one thing. But it's the cloud native stuff that always seems to get to me, right? Things where there's no APIs to get the data, or when someone went overboard on the security stuff. Like, I'd be really interested to learn if anyone here on the call has dealt with a tenant-to-tenant migration where there's sensitivity labeling involved with encryption.
Yes.
Yeah,
So-
we've done one as well.
So that's a lot of fun. Like, this is yay. You know, when I see this, I'd rather just say, hey, you know what? That's it. You find someone else to do this. Not that I'm actually going to, but at the end of the day, that encryption, sharing the keys, making sure that all the devices, because it actually has a client component attached to it, is able to open up the encryption on both sides, or just one side opening it from another, opens up a whole different ballgame in terms of what you need to do. So again, that's where the scoping comes into play, because the question that you're going to have to ask yourself, are we going to deep crypt everything before we move? Or are we going to share the key so that we can just reuse the labels that are already in place? Having a strategy around that is also really important, and to me is a crucial part of preparing the migrations.
Yeah, we had to do this at AWS, where two tenants were going into a new one, and both of them had used encryption on the source. And we had to work with Microsoft to actually get the keys out of both source tenants and inject them into the target tenant and then rekey everything. Definitely wasn't something for the faint-hearted. And you had to remove the key from the source. You couldn't even keep the key in. So it was in one tenant or the other. It couldn't be in both at the same time. But the PowerSyncPro software, the agent can bootstrap the AIP stuff as well. So you can at least pass information to it, and it will set the redirects in the registry and at least bootstrap, so you get the new labels. But like you say, those are not easy things. And we haven't mentioned the P word, Power Platform. There are tools around that claim to do stuff in this area, but it is you have to be very masochistic, I think, to try and migrate that en masse. It's just difficult.
I mean, at some points, and I've given some customers that advice as well. Like, are you sure you want to migrate? Like, are you sure you want to merge? A divestiture, I kind of get, right? You want to get rid of things. But merging, it almost feels like in some scenarios it's easier to keep two tenants, especially with the cross-tenant collaboration capabilities that we have. That at some point it just makes sense. Again, if you're not sharing a domain name and stuff like that, inviting guests and making sure one has access to the other one and making sure that there's a synchronization process in place almost seems easier than going through the pain of trying to migrate everything. And the larger the environment, the harder it gets, or the more cloud native it is, the harder it gets. So.
You mentioned the cross-tenant stuff. We're finding now that clients tend to get confused between the cross-tenant collaboration and shared channels, and they try and use both at the same time and get unstuck. I don't know if other people have seen that sort of thing. Where they now have a kind of a mismatch of stuff, and neither really works the way they wanted to in the first place.
Well, all things considered, right? Can you blame them?
No,
to be fair, right? When you take a look at how these capabilities are built and how they rely on certain identities living in certain places or being synchronized in a certain way, I mean, it's no wonder that stuff breaks. So at our own company, I've always been the one who said, no, we're not going to use shared channels just because of that reason. Not that I'm looking to migrate, but it's just adding a certain layer of unclarity. It's like a fog that you're adding on top of stuff, and people just get lost because it looks the same. It's kind of like the difference between UPN and email. We all know what the difference is, but try and explain that to a user. The UPN is like an email. It looks like an email. It behaves like an email, but really isn't necessarily. Could be though. I mean, that's a fun conversation to have. It's the same thing with guest accounts and all the sorts.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
So maybe go ahead, Twan.
Oh no, I was going to mention Loop is the next thing that's on the horizon now. Microsoft are kind of talking more about Loop and using Loop. I have no idea whether the tools handle migrating that. I believe it's just bits of files inside OneDrive, so maybe it does migrate, but that'll be the next thing for me to watch. It will be, okay, well, what does happen when you migrate content that is actually loop content?
Again, content is one thing. Like at some point, it's stored somewhere somehow, whether it's in in the mailbox or in a file. But it's everything else that is connected to that, right? Like a
Yes.
OneNote file, for instance. It's easy to move the file, but once you've shared it with someone in your source tenant, and that person is moving in a different way, then is it shared or is it no longer shared? And once you start collaborating with guests on that, because you can do that, you now have that spider web because in your opinion, you're just moving that data from one end to another, but it's really connected to 6 other tenants with everyone that you're collaborating on.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, imagine doing that with labeling and guests external and you're just combining all the cloud native stuff, which gives a great cloud experience, but makes for a shitty migration afterwards. So
Yeah, it just becomes very hard to unpick all that stuff, doesn't it?
yeah, it does. But I do want to circle back a little bit on the device migration stuff, right? I know that you're not going to push on the solution, but I think people in the call, if they're not familiar with what you guys do, let me just share a little bit of my experiences, right? Up until quite recently, we used to do a lot of migrations, but we didn't have a really great way of handling the user experience on the devices themselves. But being able to have 2 things that that your solutions do is like handle the identities which are directly related to devices, right? And then being able to easily, and may I add, with a fairly user-friendly experience, migrate them, move them from one scenario to another, whatever the scenario is. To me, that's super powerful. Like the current customer I was working with, we started planning the migration, kind of like Andrew mentioned earlier. Like, hey, we're gonna go cloud native, so we're gonna join them and do Intune and do autopilot. And then somewhere halfway along the planning, customer said, "Oh, hold on for a second. Does that mean that we have to gonna restage 900 devices?" I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "No, we're not gonna do that. Like, I've got 2 folks in IT. There's no way that we're gonna do 900 devices in a week and deal with the outfall. So can we do it differently?" And being able to switch from, okay, so we're gonna go from your current 80 joint to hybrid joint, without any impact. It's literally just tick in the box and just tell the agent, now do this. That was a lifesaver because in other scenarios, I probably would have had to look at, okay, so how are we going to deal with this? Because we're not even talking about an AD migration. We're just talking about multiple tenants connected, potentially connected to the same AD today, moving to a net new tenant connected to that same AD. And so whilst we could have handled this with the native Microsoft tools, have the PowerSyncPro solution in place really helped us, take away that complexity, but give the flexibility to kind of move all sorts of places. So maybe, if you could share a little bit more about that, because I think, that's something I feel the audience should definitely understand.
Okay. Yeah, like you said, I didn't really want to just push the product because this is more a discussion than the product. But the migration agent, like Michael said, it's got a lot of flexibility. You can migrate from AD joint or hybrid joint over to another tenant. You can be hybrid joint on that other tenant. You can migrate between Active Directories if you really want to. We're seeing lots of people now going AD or hybrid joint up to Entra join, either in the same tenant or cross tenant. And we've seen an influx of Google migrations where actually they don't have AD. They just have a whole bunch of workgroup machines. So we're bringing those into scope now, so you can take a workgroup machine, get it into AD if you wanted to, or into Entra. So kind of trying to get everything into that target. And like you say, making that user experience as simple as possible. So they just get a pop-up to say, your migration is due to start. You've got 1 hour to kind of save your work, or if you want to, you can click yes and do the migration now. If they click yes, they'll get a migration in progress. The machine will reboot. I think it reboots a couple of times. And then once that, whilst that rebooting is going on, their lock screen has changed so they can see, okay, the machine is still migrating. And then when the machine is finished and they log back in, they'll get a confirmation to say, okay, your migration is now finished. You're good to move forward. So we kind of hold their hand the whole way. And all of those dialogues you can customize, you can do in different languages. So the agent will check which language the user is actually using on the device and display their prompt in the language that you've chosen for them. You can add a QR code. So when the user's migrating, they can scan the QR code, which may have more information about that migration, or may have information about, okay, well, what do I need to do with my mobile devices, or my other implications, like we mentioned, third-party tenants, information about who do they contact, what do they say. So we found that has really helped with the workstation migration. And then the other part of PowerSyncPro was the directory synchronization, synchronizing users, groups, contacts, between Active Directory, Entra, or Google. So kind of getting that identity right, because without getting the identity right, as you will all know, migration doesn't go very well. Your mappings aren't right. So definitely the tool helping with that matching or actually creating the remote users on the target really helps with a smooth migration.
Yeah, definitely. It's I mean, for us, it's been a I'm not going to say lifesaver. I mean, it's helped us navigate some of the complexities, but also, take away a lot of the work involved with having to do it either manually or making sure that the synchronization engines that you're already using are up to par. The only thing that we're not doing today, like we're using it to move identities and prep, or actually, first of all, prep identities, do the data migration, then move the identities, update the target identities to have all the attributes that we need, and then we do a soft match with the on-premises Entra ID Connect that we still have running, and that's a process that works really well. But not having to deal with the synchronizations and exporting attributes and updating them manually and making sure and checking all over the place. That's, I mean, I appreciate the fact that it just saves time. Oh yeah, it does.
Yeah, absolutely, doesn't it?
It does.
One thing I should have said for the migration agent is you do have places to inject your own logic in there. So if you want to customize the process, say we've had to remove SCCM clients, for example, we add a script in, the migration runs that as part of its orchestration. At the end, you can do things like add a new endpoint protection software, whatever you need on that machine as part of the migration.
Mm-hmm.
And we always make sure the machine is Intune enrolled. Of course, at the end, you've got an option to tick on the runbook, but if you tick it, it will become Intune enrolled based on the first person who logs onto the machine after migration, who has an Intune license and who's allowed to MDM. They become the primary owner of that machine. And like you say, that's kind of worked well. We've got new features that we're adding. So one that we're going to work on is you mentioned the autopilot hashes. So we'll take care of that for you. So we'll take the autopilot hash off the old tenant. We'll actually capture the scope tag that's on there. You'll have an option to take that tag, put it into the target as is, or we can translate it, or you can set a default one, and we'll make sure the hardware hash is there as well. So we kind of avoid you having to do that bit as part of the process. And kind of any of these kinds of things that you're finding you're having to do that would be easier if a tool did it, always talk to us. We're pretty pliable in terms of making sure the dev stack is in the right priority order for people. Anyone have any questions or topics you want to kind of drill into these last few minutes?
Sorry, just one more from me.
Yeah, Andrew.
Licensing. When it comes to migrations, or for your tool, what's the licensing for that? But also with tenant to tenant, obviously you need licenses in both tenants, which means doubling up on cost. Now, I have been in situations where Microsoft have been kind enough to almost give you an extension, but that's at Microsoft's kind of discretion. So it's how do you deal with that? Because again, that comes down to scoping, I guess.
It does, right? So I've been part of some migrations where at the mercy of the the gods. We got a couple of weeks of extras, which is fine. And typically, I find that when you're in an enterprise agreement, that just goes over well. You just have to prepare it, know whom to talk to, and typically you'll get that extension or the double licenses because you're not using them double. Once you're not in an EA and that you're just going into a scenario where you have to purchase your licenses for the new tenant, you actually end up having to pay for them for twice for a short period of time. And then execution is key because you want to keep that period as short as possible. You really want to time it so that you're basically activating licenses or purchasing, adding them to a tenant during the weekend that you're doing the migration, you're activating them and then immediately taking them away from the target tenant so that within a couple of days, you stop paying twice, I would say, in a certain way. Now, obviously, it really depends on if you've got monthly licenses, you've got the 30 days that you're paying for anyway. So then you'll have to play with this is my ultimate end date on the source tenant. This is the start date on the target tenant. And then make sure that it only overlaps a couple of days. But you also have to account for sufficient time to not immediately delete all the data in the source tenant. Like what we typically see is that the source tenant data is kept for a little while longer, the just in case scenario. What if not everything moved over, or what if I forgot to move over something or didn't put it in scope? Then I need my people to be able to log on to the source tenant again to go and grab what they need before the licenses expire. Now, there's all sorts of way around that, right? You can keep a couple of licenses and then just create a bunch of inactive mailboxes, and probably gonna get shot for giving you that advice. But that's what we end up doing with the mailboxes. But how about sites and everything else?
Shared mailboxes.
Yeah. Well, no, actually. So here's the thing. I'm a big fan of inactive mailboxes because that's, totally compliant. You just put in a hold policy, delete the mailbox. The restore process is a big royal pain. But shared mailboxes actually is a license violation because it says that in a shared mailbox, you cannot have email that belongs to a single person. So if you convert a regular mailbox to a shared mailbox, you're actually in violation of that. Now, no one's going to check, I know, but there's the doing right and there's doing right.
Yeah.
So
I think, like you said, for EA agreements, I've not come across one where Microsoft haven't given an extension. It's usually 90 days, and some of the big clients that have more muscle can get down to 180 days. But CSP, Microsoft have almost made it more difficult because obviously they make the CSP price more attractive if you buy on an annual commit, but you're on an annual commit. So the CSP has not as much leeway unless they have a good relationship with their CSP provider to switch you around. So yeah, as Michael says, it can get a bit tricky on Microsoft licensing.
I mean, you can work with trial licenses, and what we've done before is, get some trial licenses, get them extended, then ask for, hey, can we just have a couple more without it actually counting towards the, because you're limited in the number of trial licenses that you have or something of the sorts in order to make it manageable because, there's CSP customers out there with 1,000 users. I mean, 1,000 times an E5 license. I mean, I wouldn't want to pay for it twice.
It's expensive, yeah.
Yep.
And you asked about the licensing for the PowerSyncPro software. So we have either a bundle or two independent licenses, one for directory sync, which is on a per user basis, and one for the migration agent, which is on a device basis. So rough numbers, and I think is on the call, rough numbers are £10 for the migration agent and £5 for the DirSync, or we combine them together at 14, I believe.
1480. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
So relatively easy. There's obviously price breaks for different sizes and stuff like that, and partner pricing. We're on the PowerSyncPro side. We're definitely a partner play, so we want to work with partners who actually use the software. We don't actually want to do the migrations. We want someone else to do that. So we're happy to work with partners, and if a client comes to us that needs a partner, we just push them onto the partner channel. We really don't want to do them ourselves anymore. There was a question that I saw in the chat, which migration tools you use along with this?
So obviously we do use PowerSyncPro, but for the content migrations, the answer is it depends. Like we sometimes have customers that already have like ShareGate for other stuff. Then we're more than happy to use that tool to move cross-tenant some of the data. Historically, we've used Quest quite a bit, but we've moved back to BitTight and Migration Wisp for some other stuff. So I'm going to say that we're going to take a look at the scope of the migration, budget of the migration, what you have to migrate, and then make a decision on the best tool out there from a content perspective, and then consider that. So
yeah, and Nero Blanco, we're kind of the same. So we use BitTitan quite a lot, AvePoint, ShareGate. We have used Quest before. I think CloudM's another one that we've used. And it depends. These tools tend to bunny hop over each other. They suddenly have a feature that actually is quite cool. Like AvePoint has a cool feature for Google migrations where actually the drive migrations look the way they did in Google, even though it's in the tenant. The other tools don't do that. So at the moment, we're using that more for the data migration. But yeah, it depends on the requirements and on the data and the size and whether the client has a preference.
Yeah, and I think that is the best approach. Obviously, it makes it harder because you want to get familiar with one tool or another. And to be fair, and dating myself, like 10 years ago, I was a go-to BitTitan customer. Then at some point they got acquired or they sold off. I don't know. And then their support really went bad. So that's when I moved over to another tool. So we ventured back like last year. We're quite happy with it, to be fair. Sure, we ran into some API issues with Microsoft, but they were fixed quite fast. I mean, but that's something everyone runs into. So I think that kind of it really depends on the migration itself. I did notice there was another question. Not sure how it relates to the content migration, but someone is asking whether we use Ingram Micro or TD SYNNX. I assume that you're talking about the tier 1 or tier 2 scenario, or which one is the CSP distributor? Is that what you were after, Guy?
Or it might be PowerSyncPro, whether PowerSyncPro has any disties.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Not sure.
Oh, yeah.
All right. I don't think we've signed any disties at the moment, but we're always open to looking. There's one that we've used in the States called Liquid PC, but I don't think we've got any
No, we don't have any
here yet.
Yeah, not in the UK yet. Happy to look into it if there's a need, that's for sure.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for your time. It's great to have a chat with everyone. Good to see you again, Andrew. It was definitely a blast from the past when I saw your email address. Oh, used to work with you a long time ago.
Yep. Good to see you again.
Yeah, definitely.
Good to see you too, Michael.
Yep, likewise. Always a pleasure. So thanks, everyone. It was fun, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, both.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.